As Russia's war with Ukraine grinds towards its 4th anniversary, the country's economy is increasingly dominated by the Kremlin's insatiable military-industrial complex. Authorities are spending records amount to keep the conflict going, pouring billions upon billions of dollars into military development, production, recruitment, and so on. And Russian people are seriously starting to feel the heat. Recently released details from both Russia and Ukraine reveal dramatic declines in consumer activity, as well as increasing reports of Russian people suffering labor rights violations. The more this sort of thing happens, the more anger and resentment is going to bubble up to the surface, putting Russia's President Vladimir Putin and his Kremlin cronies under serious pressure into 2026 and beyond. It's no secret that this war has been an extremely costly one for Russia in more ways than one. It has paid an extortionate price in blood, steel, and rubles for the capture of around 20% of Ukrainian territory, suffering, according to the latest figures from the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense, a staggering 1.14 million casualties in total, including approximately 353,000 casualties in 2025 alone. Data also shows that the country has suffered extraordinary losses in terms of equipment, with the latest figures from open-source intelligence analysis group Oryx putting the totals at around 4,250 tanks, 8,639 armoured and infantry fighting vehicles, 704 armoured personnel carriers, 412 infantry mobility vehicles, 541 towed artillery, 991 self-propelled artillery, 170 aircraft, 112 radars, and hundreds more air defense systems, rocket launchers, helicopters, and other assets. But even ignoring the costs in terms of people, tanks, and other hardware, Russia has also lost an almost incalculable amount of money during its war with Ukraine so far, and its spending has spiraled completely out of control in 2025. Indeed, according to year-end estimates from the country's own Ministry of Defense, Russia's total military expenditure for 2025 is set to be around 20% more than initially planned. This was revealed by the Center for Countering Disinformation, a working body of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, established in 2021 and tasked with identifying and counteracting disinformation, propaganda, and destructive digital information campaigns designed to manipulate public opinion. In a lengthy Telegram post, the center explained, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, total spending will reach 15.9 trillion rubles, $198.8 billion, or approximately 7.3% of GDP. This is 2.4 million rubles, around $30 billion, more than budgeted. On average, the state spends 213 billion rubles, around $2.7 billion, per week on the war. This amount could be the annual budget for a large Russian region. $2.7 billion a week. As the Post notes, that kind of money could keep an entire Russian region running for a year. It could be put to countless positive uses, like feeding and housing Russian people, ensuring that the country's children have access to education, funding domestic infrastructure development, improving healthcare and public services, or supporting and improving the lives of the country's population in dozens, if not hundreds of other ways. Instead, it's being used to fund a war that an increasing majority of the Russian population want to see come to an end. A war that very few people truly understand anymore, and one that has been stuck in a grim stalemate-like situation for a very long time now. And it's worth noting that this isn't even the full amount that Russia is spending on the war each week. As the center's post goes on to explain, and these are only the expenses of the Russian Ministry of Defense. Separately, the regions are responsible for payments to contract workers, compensation to the families of the deceased, treatment of the wounded, prosthetics, and burial. For many subjects of the Federation, this becomes an unbearable financial burden. In other words, in addition to the colossal amount of cash going towards things like paying personnel's salaries, producing munitions, manufacturing, and so on, Russia's regions are also having to cover the countless hidden costs of the war, like compensation payouts to soldiers who are killed in Ukraine and healthcare fees for those that come home wounded. And with over 1.1 million casualties and counting, those costs too are almost impossible to calculate. Yet Russia still persists with its war. Still it funnels unfathomable amounts of money into the conflict, which tells us exactly where Putin's priorities lie, as the center's post concludes. Even with a budget deficit and declining oil and gas revenues, the Kremlin is only increasing military spending. This policy shows that war and imperial ambitions are even more important to Putin than the economic stability of the state. Even in times of war, many countries will be able to recognize that this level of spending simply isn't smart, strategic, or sustainable. Russia, however, stubbornly makes the same mistake again and again, shows no signs of adjusting its approach, and appears unashamed of its reckless spending. Indeed, the country's own defense minister Andrei Belousov recently admitted that direct spending on the war with Ukraine will have consumed over 5.1% of Russia's GDP, or around 11 trillion rubles, around $137 billion minimum by the end of 2025. That's over 80% of the country's entire defense budget. Belousov made the announcement during a recent Defense Ministry board meeting on December 17th, and it was one of the rare occasions in which a high-ranking Russian official openly acknowledged just how costly the conflict has become and will continue to be for the foreseeable future. Independent analysis from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, have estimated Russia's total projected defense spending for 2025 to be at around 15.5 trillion rubles, around $190 billion, which works out at around 7.2% of GDP. The defense minister's figures largely align with this estimate, demonstrating just how deeply entrenched the Russian economy is in the war. Projected expenditure for the coming year, 2026, is equally extortionate. Even though Vladimir Putin promised earlier in the year that Russia would make efforts to cut down its military spending, recent drafts of the country's 2026 budget tell a different story. Projected total defense and security spending next year is set to amount to around 16.8 trillion rubles, or around 38% of all federal spending. It's worth noting too that according to Reuters, approximately 84% of Russia's defense spending is classified, meaning that we may never know the true costs of the war. The Kremlin also has the authority to increase military funding at any time, as and when Putin decides, and the very fact that such an enormous amount has been allocated to defense spending demonstrates quite clearly that the Russian president is not interested in peace talks or ceasefire agreements. Russia is all in on this war, committed to the long haul and ready to keep on spending whatever it takes until it achieves its objectives. The Russian people, meanwhile, are being dragged along for the ride, whether they like it or not. And the costs of the war are really starting to hit home for many of them. Indeed, as the country prepares to celebrate New Year, the most festive occasion on the Russian calendar, data shows that an increasing amount of Russian citizens are tightening the purse strings and seeking to save money wherever and however they can. This news comes directly from the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine, or FISU, one of the country's leading intelligence agencies. In a December 21st report, FISU officials explain, preparations for the New Year celebrations in Russia are taking place against the background of a noticeable decline in consumer activity. There is a general trend toward austerity. The Russians are increasingly refusing to make unnecessary purchases and are limiting themselves to a minimum set of goods and services. The average budget for the 2026 celebrations is about 14,000 rubles, which is almost half of what was planned to be spent in 2025. This certainly isn't normal. New Year is to Russia what Christmas is to the United States. It's the time of year when almost all people, regardless of their wealth or social status, indulge in their favorite things, buying and exchanging gifts with one another, preparing large family feasts and splashing their cash on some of the finer things in life, from caviar and smoked salmon to other delicacies and luxuries. But according to the FISU's data, this year is set to be a far leaner and tighter celebration for the majority of Russian households, with many people simply feeling unable to afford the kind of exuberant and indulgent New Year they would usually have planned. The report goes on to explain several core reasons behind this trend, citing rising inflation and increases in the cost of food, housing and utilities and clothing. Data backs this up, with high levels of food inflation across Russia throughout 2025 and numerous reports revealing that the prices of many everyday essentials have surged since the war began. Much of this can be at least partly linked back to the impact of Western sanctions on the Russian economy, as well as the fact that many brands left the Russian market soon after the invasion of Ukraine. Russia also now struggles to import goods from around the world, leaving its people with both fewer options and higher prices for everything from food to clothes to domestic goods. The FISU report goes on to note that purchases of traditional New Year's delicacies are declining. In general, the holiday menu is reduced to simple and still affordable food products. In addition, while many Russian people would typically travel around the country at this time of year to spend quality time with friends and family, or even take international vacations, the FISU's data suggests that more people than usual will be spending the holidays at home or opting for cost-saving alternatives. The interest is growing in alternative, relatively cheaper forms of recreation. Instead of traveling abroad, the Russians are choosing to rent country houses within their country, often in large groups, which allow them to share the costs. The holiday services market is struggling with low levels of demand, with the likes of event organizers and restaurants seeing clear declines in orders and purchases, which, in the words of the FISU, indicates extremely cautious consumer behavior. The report also notes that New Year typically tends to be an emotional time for Russians in general, with the country's mortality rate rising by an average of 24% and peaking on New Year's Eve and day, On January 1st, for instance, an estimated 2,000 people died nationwide, primarily due to the likes of alcohol abuse, overeating, traffic-related accidents, and domestic conflicts. Some also take their own lives, particularly those who are forced to spend the holiday period on their own, without the comfort of friends and family around them. This year's celebrations have the potential to be some of the worst in years for the Russian population, with so many feeling the negative impact of the war on their personal life. Indeed, a poll held back in September showed that not only did the majority of Russian people favour peace talks over prolonging the conflict, but many had also suffered some sort of loss because of the war. That might include the loss of a loved one who went to fight on the front lines, some sort of financial loss related to the economic effects of the war, or mental and emotional losses related to stress, family breakdowns, and so on. Put simply, the national mood across Russia is relatively morose at this moment in time. Putin might have been banking on big New Year's celebrations to lift the country's spirits, and Moscow has been fittingly decked out with some of the most elaborate and grandiose decorations in years. But the fact of the matter is clear to see. Many Russian people simply don't have the money to enjoy the holidays, and an increasing number aren't in any mood to celebrate either. As the FISU report concludes, thus New Year's Eve in Russia is increasingly losing its characteristics of a large-scale and joyful holiday and is turning into a restrained, psychologically tense event. Despite their reluctance to completely abandon traditions, most citizens of the RF will welcome the year 2026 in mode of austerity and growing social fatigue, which clearly reflects the general state of consumer and public moods in the country. A separate FISU report published on December 20th revealed that an increasing number of Russian families are facing an even deeper financial crisis, with tens of thousands of households issuing complaints about salaries not being paid and labor rights being violated. At the end of the year, Russia's economy is showing signs of systemic tension, reflected in a sharp increase in complaints from citizens about violations of labor rights. According to Rostrud, Russia's Federal Service for Labor and Employment, the number of complaints at the beginning of December exceeded 70,000, which is 1.5 times more than last year. The largest increase was recorded in the category of complaints about delayed wages, more than 26,000 cases, which is by 60% more than a year ago. At the same time, the number of complaints about illegal dismissals increased by 33%. In other words, tens of thousands of Russian workers are being either fired or not being paid their wages on time, suggesting that companies are facing serious cash flow problems. The report goes on to note that at the end of October, Russia was dealing with around 2.2 billion rubles worth of wage arrears, which is 3 times higher than the same time last year and the highest level since August of 2020. The country's Federal State Statistics Service, Rosstat, continues to report consistent economic growth, but digging into the data, the FISU notes a critical dependence on the military-industrial complex, going on to explain that around 2/3 of 2025's GDP growth was provided exclusively by the defense industry. And while many defense contractors have become richer, the same cannot be said for countless other businesses in Russia's many other industrial sectors. At the same time, corporate profits for the first 3 quarters of 2025 decreased by 7.7%. This increases the risk of delayed wages, which leads to an increase in credit debt, problems in the banking sector, and the threat of a larger economic crisis. As of December 1st, the amount of unpaid installments for new buildings reached 1.5 trillion rubles, which is 17% of the contracts concluded. The report concludes that Russia has reached a point where any sort of economic growth or success is almost entirely dependent on military spending, with many other aspects of the country's economy facing a deepening crisis. This has led to some truly shocking statistics, like the fact that according to FISU once again, Russian prisoners are now being paid more than teachers. According to intelligence data back in 2019, prisoners in Russia received average salaries of 14,700 rubles per month. By 2025, that had risen to 33,000, representing about a 124.5% increase. In comparison, in 73 regions around Russia, average teacher salaries are below the minimum wage of 22,400 rubles and far lower than prisoner averages. It's hardly surprising, therefore, that Russia's school system is said to be facing a major shortage of workers, with a deficit of around 250,000 teachers. Around 1/3 of the country's educators are over the age of 50 and approaching retirement, while many younger specialists are abandoning the idea of teaching altogether due to low pay and heavy workloads. As a result, the country's entire educational infrastructure is deteriorating, the status of teachers is declining, and Russia's children are paying the price, with ever-decreasing standards of educational support. Similar crises are impacting numerous other sectors and industries across the nation. As the military-industrial complex becomes bigger and more powerful, soaking up more of the country's budget and eating its way into other industries, sectors like automotive, agriculture, construction, and steelmaking are suffering the effects. Wages are down, labor shortages are getting worse, Smaller companies are struggling to cope, and even bigger ones are having to make cuts to remain operational. As a result, many experts predict that these kinds of industries will continue to struggle and shrink due to rising interest rates, dwindling consumer demand, and ever-increasing focus on military spending above all else. This all makes Russia's decision to continue spending close to $3 billion on the war every single week appear even more ridiculous. And the Kremlin may soon find that throwing money at its problems will no longer be enough to fix them. A recent Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, report revealed that the country is, at last, starting to see a drop in the number of volunteers signing up to fight in the war with Ukraine. Even as recruiters offer hefty signing bonuses and other financial incentives, it appears that more Russians are simply starting to say no, preferring to stay in the relative safety of their home regions, remaining close to their loved ones, even if it means having less money in the long run. As the ISW notes, the number of people signing contracts with the Russian Ministry of Defense, MOD, is not increasing, even in regions offering the highest financial incentives. The report goes on to suggest that those who wanted to make money from the war had essentially already signed up, and those left behind are increasingly unlikely to be swayed into putting their lives on the line, even for a few million rubles. Even as regional payouts have risen by averages of around 500,000 rubles, $6,100, every 3 to 4 months, the total number of new recruits has started to decline. The Institute goes on to conclude that if this trend continues, as it is expected to do, it might even be enough to force Putin to resort to drastic action, either beginning some sort of involuntary reserve mobilization, which would be extremely unpopular with the masses, or coming to the negotiating table to end the war, which he obviously has no desire to do. In short, Putin's stuck between a rock and a hard place, and the more money he wastes on the war, the worse it's going to get for him, his legacy, and most importantly, his people. In the meantime, Russia's forces are still struggling to make consistent gains on the ground and just recently suffered a serious setback in Donetsk, which you can learn all about in this video. Or for a deeper look at how and why this war truly started, check out this video, which looks at the secret reasons behind Putin's plans for Ukraine. To make sure you don't miss out on more breaking news and in-depth analysis of the Russia-Ukraine war and other important military matters from around the world, subscribe to our channel today. And thanks for watching.